welcome to This Explainer. Look, today we're putting on our historical detective hats to deconstruct one of the most pivotal and, frankly, most misunderstood eras in all of Islamic history, the Great Fitna. We're not just going to sit here and recount dates or memorize old battles. No, we're doing something much more important. We are stepping completely away from traditional sanctification. We're stripping back the myths to look at the raw psychological and social realities, like tribalism, that really drove these events. We're approaching this whole thing with the objective, critical eye of an enlightened researcher. Let's dive in. So, here's the massive question we have to answer. How did a divine message of peace, a community famously described as being perfectly united in one trench, suddenly fracture into violent, armed conflict? And even more importantly for us, why does this exact same pattern continue to tear apart our modern world today? To figure this out, we have to look past those heavily filtered traditional narratives. We need to examine the very human, psychological flaws that popped up the exact moment the direct supervision of divine revelation was lifted. To guide us from historical shock to real intellectual liberation, we're going to follow the critical methodology of the great Arab thinker Ali Mohammed Al-Shurafa Al-Hammadi, founder of the International Message of Peace Foundation. We'll be hitting 5 core areas: the human nature of the companions, the hidden dangers of sanctification, the absolute power of pure monotheism, how to use the Quran as our ultimate scale, and finally, how to liberate our consciousness today.
Okay, Section 1, Deconstructing the Fitna and the Humanness of the Companions. You know, the Quran actually anticipated human nature's tendency toward conflict. It explicitly warned that straying from unity and falling into dispute opens the door to failure. It drains your strength. This establishes a really strict historical law for us. Just being chronologically close to the time of revelation does not magically grant anyone immunity from human ambition, psychological struggles, or the destructive pull of partisanship.
And we see this play out in a really rapid, tragic sequence of events. Think about it. We start with a society perfectly regulated by divine revelation. But literally the moment that direct prophetic presence is gone, the destructive force of tribalism and the sheer human desire for power immediately bubble up at the Saqifa meeting. And it just snowballs from there into the bloody, heartbreaking battles of Jamal and Siffin. Tragically, this set a dangerous precedent. And guess what? Modern political conflicts are still being justified using the exact same religious language inherited from those very events.
We absolutely must fundamentally reframe how we view that early community. The companions were humans. They were subject to the exact same sociological laws you or I are. Once that divine supervision was lifted, they were driven by ambition, fear, and deep-seated tribalism. We have to break out of the trap of rigid traditionalism that tells us we aren't allowed to question the past. Because honestly, it's only by viewing these historical figures objectively as humans, rather than these mythological and fallible icons, that we can actually analyze the Great Fitna rationally and learn from their mistakes.
Moving right along to Section 2, the danger of sanctification and intermediaries.
As the great thinker Al-Shurafa Al-Hammadi brilliantly identifies, sanctification is a deeply dangerous psychological tendency. It's basically our innate human desire to elevate other humans into intermediaries between us and God. Why do we do this? Well, we want false reassurance. We want an easy, comfortable path to salvation that lets us escape our own individual accountability. This fatal flaw in religious history directly undermines the core, liberating message of the Islamic faith.
To counter this totally natural human tendency, the Quran is incredibly strict about boundaries. It firmly establishes the prophet purely as a faithful human messenger, a man who receives revelation. That's it. He is not a divine intermediary. He's not an independent source of holiness that rivals the Creator. The text firmly, permanently closes the door on the deification of human beings, protecting the absolute purity of the message. So you can really see a stark contrast in how we approach faith here. On one side, the true Quranic approach demands a direct, unmediated relationship with the Creator. Absolutely no gatekeepers allowed. But on the other side, traditional, historical narratives heavily promote dependency on human symbols. This drastically shifts everything. It turns us from active, thinking individuals directly accountable to God into passive followers completely dependent on the perceived blessings of historical figures. And look, this isn't just an Islamic issue, it's a universal historical pattern. Just look at the early trajectory of Christianity. Exaggerated reverence for Jesus as a prophet eventually accumulated so many layers of sanctification until it literally led to deification. The Quran acts to aggressively correct this exact pattern. The sociological rule is simple, really. Whenever layers of sanctification accumulate around a human symbol, the space for pure monotheism in our consciousness shrinks. Which brings us perfectly to Section 3, Pure Monotheism and Individual Responsibility. Pure monotheism, or Tawheed, is, at its absolute core, a comprehensive project of liberation. It frees us from the fear of men and the fear of the unknown. It completely removes any reliance on human intermediaries. And most importantly, it restores our human dignity by establishing direct, individual accountability. It empowers us to take responsibility for our own actions, rather than lazily relying on some perceived salvation granted by blindly following historical figures. Now, I know some folks might find this critical approach a bit uncomfortable, but as Al-Shurafa emphasizes, criticizing historical exaggeration is not an attack on religion. It's actually a civilizational necessity. Dismantling these popular myths and inherited traditions is required to protect the faith. Without rigorous questioning, religion just morphs into a closed, deviant structure full of human manipulation, instead of the empowering divine message it was meant to be. All right, Section 4, the Quran as a scale for evaluating narratives.
In the ongoing battle for our consciousness, we are constantly bombarded with contradictory texts, traditions, and historical narratives, often called riwayat. To navigate this absolute maze, we have to use the Quranic scale as our ultimate divine benchmark. What does that mean? It means any historical narrative or tradition that contradicts the Quran's clear principles of justice, mercy, and a direct connection with God must be firmly, unapologetically rejected. No exceptions.
The outcomes of these two competing methodologies are literally night and day. Relying on the infallible Quranic scale builds an independent, rational, thinking individual, which fosters a society built on ethics and mutual respect. But relying on those contradictory, fabricated historical narratives, many of which, by the way, were politically motivated to serve specific ancient dynasties, that just fosters fear, blind dependency, and ultimately deeply entrenched sectarian conflict. And here is exactly why this matters to you and me right now, today. The fragility of awareness in the past is actively breeding the political conflicts of our present. The absence of this precise Quranic scale and our stubborn reliance on conflicting human texts is exactly what justifies the sectarian and political fragmentation we suffer from right now. We are quite literally paying the price today for the unexamined narratives of yesterday. Finally, Section 5. Liberating consciousness for societal renaissance. Let's talk solutions. When we stop blindly imitating the past and actually use the Quranic scale to filter our heritage, we achieve a truly independent, liberated consciousness. We transition from being passive recipients of history to active, rational participants. This kind of intellectual freedom is a game changer. It allows us to end endless ideological conflicts, completely wipe out blind following, and finally focus our collective energy on true civilization building and social justice. So, to the youth out there seeking the truth and trying to navigate this incredibly complex modern world, here is your practical path to freedom. Step 1. Subject absolutely every inherited narrative to the Quranic scale. Step 2. Fiercely reject any text that promotes division, tribalism, or sectarianism. And Step 3. Reclaim your independent intellectual agency. Understand your faith directly, using your own mind, without relying on any human intermediaries whatsoever. The societal impact of making this shift is undeniable. A society that anchors itself in the rational, ethical Quranic scale naturally achieves balance, security, and true civilization. Conversely, a society that remains trapped in following human symbols and inherited narratives, well, that society is doomed to breed ongoing conflict, fear, and intellectual dependency. The contrast couldn't be clearer. So I leave you with this monumental choice. Will we remain prisoners of inherited human history, blindly repeating the tragedies, tribalism, and sectarianism of the Great Fitna? Or will we boldly follow the critical methodology championed by thinkers like Ali Al-Shurafa, use the ultimate Quranic scale to free our minds, protect pure monotheism, and forge a unified path forward? Think about it. It's time to reclaim our minds. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.
مؤسسة رسالة السلام العالمية، رسالة إنسانية لعالم أكثر سلاماً.